Thank you, Professor Gano, and thanks to all of you for being here, either by your own free will or by your professor's will. Over the years, I've had the privilege of speaking at dozens, if not hundreds, of conferences in the United States and abroad. And honestly, I cannot recall one as carefully planned and as well organized as this one, with breakout panels with leaders of those panels and topics that really resonate perfectly with my theme and our theme today and this evening. And seldom does one find hosts of such graciousness and gracious persistence as Sylvia Kaufman. I want to thank Sylvia. I was not easy to schedule, but she did not let up, and I'm glad she was persistent. I'm also very grateful to the consortium in general and to Aquinas College for hosting this, and to Professor Gano, and also to Doug Kinchy, director of the Kaufman Institute, who did the great labor of reading some of my writings and summarized them for some essays in the Grand Rapids Press. Last but not least, I was privileged to sit at dinner last night next to Dick Kaufman, whose dissertation at the University of Aberdeen is plumbing Jewish resources on the notion of human dignity within the context of conversions to Judaism. This topic fits well within the Keough School's emphasis on integral human development. The Keough School that we just opened in August at Notre Dame, the first new school in 100 years, is devoted to global affairs with a focus on development broadly understood around human dignity. And how do we think about economic development, peace building, human rights, and so on within this frame. And so Dick's dissertation is focusing right on topic for us. How do religious traditions understand human dignity in particular historical and contemporary context? Dick has not yet applied for a position at Notre Dame, but when he's finished with the dissertation, he certainly would be a candidate. Let me make one or two other preliminary comments quickly. In a way, some of the things I will say this afternoon and this evening may be a bit redundant, in that Doug's articles have covered very well some of the themes in the lecture. At least those of you who've read those essays prepare you for what I'm going to say. And particularly this evening, I'll draw on my esteemed mentor Martin Marty, his notion of taking the risk of hospitality. And some of you have heard from him and others about that. So in a way, much of what I say will be a refresher. There may be some originality to it, I hope. So 2 parts. First part is when we analyze religion in any context, we have to acknowledge that religion produces all kinds of effects in the world, some which are damaging to cordial and collaborative human relationships, some which produce violence, and others which are abundant in their positive social outcomes in terms of bringing people together for collaboration for the common good. So it's important to examine both sides of that dynamic in order to understand how the religions can collaborate for justice, for peace, what the obstacles to that collaboration might be, and where there's some surprising and resources, even within the conflict itself, for moving forward together toward shared goals. So the first topic today is when religions collide, sources of intra-religious and inter-religious conflict. So we want to consider, what are the sources of conflict? When we consider the dynamics within and across religions and between religions and secular actors in the world, we must begin with an acknowledgement. Conflict is inevitable. It is part of the DNA of religion and religions. One might say ruefully, of course, but of course conflict is endemic to human nature itself, so religion being part of the human enterprise, religion is going to be laden with conflict. So there's a certain kind of inevitability to religiously based conflict. The question before us today then is not how religions can collaborate to end conflict. That's impossible. But conflict in itself is not necessarily bad. It is an aspect of change, and it can be an agent of constructive change. With this in mind, the question becomes, how can religions work together to transform conflict or to channel its dynamics and energies and passions away from intolerance, hatred, violence, and into nonviolent militance, if you will, for justice, reconciliation, and peace? And one of Doug's essays mentioned in the ambivalence book, you kind of have to define your terms, because there's so much dispute over terminology, whatever the term may be. So in that book, I use the term militance more broadly. It can be used in different ways to indicate the religious, the depth of religious commitment, of the devout. It's a devotion that is militant, but it doesn't necessarily, in the way I use that term, need to be violent. We are soldiers for Christ. And that does not necessarily mean that we are violent soldiers for Christ. Gandhi considered himself a soldier of nonviolence, a militant for nonviolence. So I use the term militant in what follows to simply refer to kind of across the board dedication and devotion to God, to the sacred, to the divine. I use the term extremist to refer to a logic that sometimes can lead itself toward violence. And actually, in the larger argument, the relationship between those who are militant and those who are extremists is complicated. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But when the general question is, how can conflict retain its passion, its militance, if you will, but avoid hatred, intolerance, and violence? How can it be transformed to the good, to collaboration, to coexistence, and to mutual understanding? That's, I think, is our question. So we begin by asking, why then is religiously inspired conflict inevitable, apart from the fact that it's human and therefore it will be conflictual? And how can religions inspire conflict which leads to constructive social change, greater justice and peace? And that'll be tonight's topic. How can we talk about the constructive element? So let's start by considering three sources of conflict that's religiously inspired. And this is conflict within religious traditions as well as across religious traditions, as well as conflict between religious groups and non-religious groups. So conflict in which religious actors fight within themselves, within their own communities, fight with other religious communities, and are at odds with what is often perceived as a threatening secular or non-religious or atheistic or agnostic reality. So what are the sources of these kinds of conflicts? Number one, this is a little bit Religion 101, what I'm going to say now in the next couple of paragraphs. But number one of the sources is the nature of religion itself. The nature of religion itself. We have to come to an understanding of what we mean by religion, of which many forests have been felled. So you're going to get my take on this, not a comprehensive view. Religion itself excites disputation, stirs passion, and creates conflict, often bitter conflict. At its source, religion in this approach, religion is understood as a response to the holy, the human response to the holy, to the sacred, to the divine. These are not necessarily interchangeable terms. I'll use the term the sacred if you'd like to talk in the discussion period about what the etymology is there and what we mean. I'll be happy to. But I'm going to use the term a response to the sacred, by which I mean the holy, the divine, and so on. Sometimes the term numinous is used, which in preparing this talk, I use the term numinous all the time without really knowing what it means. So I looked it up. It comes from, I kind of know what it means, but it comes from a Latin word that means a nod toward the divine. So it's by way of saying we are drawn to and nod in the direction of, or assent to, something that is greater than oneself. So at its source, religion is the human response, both individually and collectively, throughout history, to this experience that seems to be inherent to human existence, an experience of something greater than ourselves, which we call God, or some language of that type. And I'll say a little bit more about that experience in a moment, or what others have said about it. Because religions presume to engage this uncreated reality, the sacred or the holy, the divine they are engaging is fundamentally ineffable. It's inexpressible. It really can't be comprehended by human symbols, human language. We all recognize that in this audience. But that's a challenge, that every religious expression is therefore a second-order expression. It's therefore some kind of interpretation of a reality that comprehends us that we don't comprehend. Catholic theologian Karl Rahner said, God is the ultimate reality. Well, I'm also going to mention Paul Tillich used a similar definition. God is that which comprehends us, not which we comprehend. So there's going to be at the heart of religion a battle of interpretation, or hermeneutics. What's your theory of interpretation of the sacred? So this is a fundamentally ineffable or inexpressible reality, and therefore it relies on symbols. It's symbolic. We can point to it with our meager words and signs and images, but of course we can never fully capture its essence. What is the meaning of my or our encounter with the sacred, whether on Mount Sinai or through a mystical vision or simply in the birth of a child, which of course is an encounter with the sacred. Those of you who have had children and been present at the birth of your child, when my first son was born 35 years ago now, Lord help me, I remember being present at the birth, and it was ineffable, inexpressible. I could comprehend it in a way, but not fully. It comprehended me, that this human being could emerge from another. It was definitely a mystery. Not only how was I going to pay for this, but how am I going to raise this human being? Where does this human being come from? It was, for me, certainly a religious experience. So religious experiences need not be on Mount Sinai or at the foot of the cross or traveling with the Buddha or whatever, although these are classic such experiences. But we all have experiences, I think I would argue, of an encounter with something not created, not us. So this poses its own challenges. No two parties will exactly agree upon the meaning of that encounter. They will have to come to an agreement. They'll have to, in various ways, through authority, through the building of community, they have to arrive at an agreement, even tentative, provisional agreements on what does this mean? How do we react to it? How do we respond to it? What are we to do? So, religious meanings are endurably contested and contestable. It's in the very nature of religion, contest. The Islamic world right now, one can argue, is in the middle of a decades-long, if not civil war, but a remarkably often violent, challenging confrontation and conflict about the meaning of jihad. What does it mean in the modern period, the post-colonial period, to strive to do the will of Allah as revealed in the Quran and the Hadith? This is roiling the Islamic world, and there are voices all across the spectrum about what is the role of violence, if any, in pursuing jihad. What is the role of nonviolence? What is the role of collaboration? This is something that we all know is happening in Islam, but it's not unique to Islam. The spasms of internal conflict, and we know that more Muslims have been killed in this decades-long conflict than any other religious tradition or any other category. Muslims have been killing Muslims over this conflict, as well as others. But we could talk about other religions in this regard as well at different times in history. So here I use the word religion here. It's important to refer to the communal response to the sacred, to the communal response. What do we do as communities bound together? So the Latin word is religare, to bind together. It also has a sense, religare, to read again. So religion is to bind us together. It's a communal response. It also, I'll come back to this, to read again, to religare, or read again, to read for the second time. Both William James and Alfred North Whitehead included under the banner of religion what one does with one's solitude. But today, and the way I'll use religion today, is we would likely use the term spiritual for what one does with one's solitude, or some cognate. That is to say, the type of, what I mean by religion today really refers to a communal response. includes a communal and an institutional dimension. We might come back to James on what one does with one's solitude this evening. But for now, we're talking about a communal response, a collective response, and the complexities of bringing agreement within that community around certain religious precepts, doctrines, and so on. So, religion is ineffable. It's too great or extreme to be described or comprehended in words. It's inexpressible. In fact, it's unutterable. The sacred is unutterable, to put it dramatically. I'll mention two sources of many in the scholarship on religion. One is by Rudolf Otto, who was one of the earliest comparativists of religion in the late 19th, early 20th century. 1921, he wrote a book, Das Heilige, that was translated as The Idea of the Holy. So he was one of the scholars of what we today might call religious studies early. And he had looked at what he could find and what he could research on primitive religions, on archaic religions, and also on religions since the Reformation, and had thought philosophically and comparatively about what is the phenomenon of religion. When we're within a religious community, we don't necessarily think that way. We think about Christ or the Prophet Muhammad or whatever our particular religious community is engaged with in terms of the sacred. But in Otto's case, he was looking more generically and trying to ask, can we specify across time and space what people say about expressions of the encounter with the sacred or religion? William James, whom I mentioned in the American context, did something similarly with more of a focus on the psychological, perhaps. So I'll mention Otto, because he came up with a useful slogan for a 45-minute talk than a month-long or a semester-long course. He said, the way to summarize the human encounter with the sacred is it's an encounter of mysterium tremendum et fascinans. Mysterium tremendum et fascinans. How many of you are familiar with that phrase? Some of you are. Just get a sense. Students? Not. Okay, that'll be on the test. So mysterium tremendum et fascinans is a kind of, I think, nice slogan to get at some of the challenges and the sources of conflict within religion. So mysterium, you can figure out what that refers to. This reality that we've encountered on Mount Sinai or in the birth of the baby or whatever it may be is utterly ineffable. It's not me. It is mysterious in that sense. It is a reality that I can't quite comprehend. It's not like anything I've experienced before, as far as I know. It's profoundly unplumbable. I can't really get to the heart of it, even though I've experienced it, okay? Tremendum, well, you would think tremendous, yes, but there's more of a sense in this term in the Latin of a tremor, that this encounter causes me to shake, to tremble. That is, I recognize in this encounter, not only that this is not me, but that I am a contingent being. And aren't we all? If this planet were a little bit closer to the sun, we wouldn't be here. If we didn't have the right amount of oxygen in the air and so forth. We walk around pretending that we're invulnerable and autonomous and so forth, but in fact, we're heavily contingent and dependent. Our life hangs on a thread at every moment. We think we are, masters of the universe. It's not the case. When we come in contact with the master of the universe, it becomes painfully clear that we are not the master of the universe, and so we are trembling, soul-shaking, frightening. And then fascinans, interesting, is a little bit, the term would be intriguing, or I recognize. So there's a little bit of a paradox here. This is other, it's mysterious, it's radically other, it's not me. It threatens me in a way, or it reveals to me how dependent, contingent I am, and yet it's intriguing. It's fascinating. There's something about it I recognize, something that touches the core of my being in some way, if not familiarity, at least recognition. Andrew Greeley, the late American Catholic sociologist, once wrote that this sense is like as we grow older, we're in a prison. It's like the walls are closing in on us as we get older. and our finitude becomes clearer and clearer to us, the limits of the possibilities we face. And yet, even as this happens, and we're in our little cell, we think we hear voices on the other side, right, outside, that we're called to. So there's a sense that, yes, we're creatures, but there's a beckoning that comes beyond this sense of finitude or captivity. So that's Otto, Mysterium Tremendus et Fascinans. And one important takeaway is that when we have an experience like this, how do we express it? We can't just say, well, it's ineffable, I can't tell you about it, I have to, let's just do what Job is told to do and put my finger to my lips, not even say anything about it. It's overwhelming, it's mysterious, it's frightening, and at the end Job says, okay, I shut up, finally, after fighting with God for so many tragedies in his life. So, but we don't do that. In fact, what religion is the second order reflection on that experience. Through doctrines and dogmas and rituals and practices, we're trying to give expression to this kind of life-giving and frightening and mysterious reality. And we tend to make the mistake at times that those expressions themselves become idols for us, those dogmas and practices and rituals. And so we always have to have a kind of critical take. One of the great theorists of this, of course, was the German Lutheran theologian who died in mid-60s, Paul Tillich. And I'll just do a quick bit on Paul Tillich, who's familiar to some or many of you, who's saying something comparable to what Otto says and what James said and others about religion and the sacred. So Tillich said, religious faith brings an awareness of the sacred, number one, and that faith is certain insofar as it is an experience of the sacred, but it is uncertain insofar as it brings finite beings into relation with an infinite reality. The element of uncertainty in faith cannot be avoided and must be accepted. Tillich famously argued that doubt is included in every act of faith. The dynamic concept of faith helps to explain the interaction between faith and doubt. Every act of faith recognizes that there may be a possibility for doubt if civil or religious authority enforces conformity among members of a community of faith. This is a very important insight, that it's really, the tension is there when, out of dint of necessity sometimes, the religious authority or the state authority, the political authority says, okay, enough wrangling, enough fighting, enough killing of one another. Here's the Council of Nicaea. You're going to figure out about this God and man and come up with some formula so you'll stop killing one another in Upper Egypt. So I may not care one way or the other what you come up with, but you're going to get together and we're going to impose a rule of orthodoxy, if nothing else, to end or rechannel the conflict. Not necessarily constructively, sometimes constructively. There can't be endless fighting about these things. And yet, Tillich points out, when that happens, when almost sympathetically I'm saying, or necessarily, sometimes religious authority has to impose itself upon the rabble. When that happens, another dynamic emerges, another threat emerges, which is kind of the stifling of conscience, as we all know, or the confining of the sacred into a formula. Every act of faith recognizes there must be a possibility for doubt. If civil or religious authority, Tillich wrote, enforces conformity among members of a community of faith, then faith loses its uncertainty, which is part of its nature, its uncertainty, and the element of risk is removed from the act of faith. I use Tillich here because tonight we're going to talk about the risk of faith and the risk of hospitality that is essential to interfaith collaboration, interreligious dialogue. So here, Tillich says, faith requires risk to be vital. There has to be a risk, there's a doubt. And that too much suppression of that doubt or enforced conformity will stifle what's often most life-giving and creative about religion. This may also happen, Tillich says, if a law, creed, or doctrine excludes any possibility for uncertainty or doubt. Faith as ultimate concern, Tillich says, requires the courage to make a personal commitment. The risk involved in faith is related to the essence of uncertainty. faith may become non-dynamic or static when the risk of uncertainty is excluded by a law, creed, or doctrine. Thus, faith may be either dynamic when uncertainty is recognized or non-dynamic when the possibility of any uncertainty is excluded by faith. According to Tillich, faith is not a belief that something has a certain degree of probability. It is not a type of theoretical knowledge that is based on probability. The many historical conflicts have resulted from the misunderstanding from faith as a type of knowledge supported by a religious authority. So ultimate reality, finally, from Tillich, transcends any attempt to describe it adequately. This is much like Otto, the implications of what Otto said, and can only be described by the use of symbols. The language of faith, says Tillich, is a symbolic language used to describe ultimate reality. Now, this is important to remember that the symbols are symbols. Tillich also writes elsewhere about myths that become broken, that are revealed as myths. How do you reconstitute those myths to get to not to stop believing in them, so to speak, but to have a deeper grasp of these myths and their inner truth. So it's very important to use initially language that is allusive, A-L-L-U-S-I-V-E, connotative, almost poetic, and that becomes a bridge to other people's experiences with very different doctrinal content, or very different interpretations. If we get to the point where we can talk about awe and wonder and majesty and doubt, these kind of elemental human emotions and experiences, we're at a point of a bridge. Meanwhile, we can also put people off, although we need doctrines and dogmas, don't misunderstand me, they're very important for regulating the community and defining community boundaries, absolutely. But if we slip too quickly into the dogmatic or to the denotative language, then there are dangers there. So connotative language is, this is symbolic, it's a connotation. Denotative is, this is a podium. I don't mean that this is a metaphor for a horse. I mean, this is a podium. We've agreed to call it that. Who knows, we could call it anything. But there is an agreement that we're going to denote this kind of object as a podium. So I made a mistake that I'll never forget when that first child was born, Benjamin John, 35 years ago. I was at Chicago Lying-In Clinic and had just witnessed the faith and was walking home from that experience on March the 3rd, 1982. And he was, and it was snowing lightly, and the snowflakes were as big as the sun to me. They were just enormous. I was just completely immersed in this reality, Mysterium Terminum Fascinans. I go home and I call on, we used to have things, some of only the students won't remember this, they were phones that you would pick up and dial. So I picked up and dialed my parents, and my grandmother was on the other line on the extension. And I said to them, you should have seen this. The episiotomy was unbelievable. And then there's this thing called the placenta that comes out, and it is this mass of, it's just unbelievable. And then Ben, the baby, I realize after a second it's completely silent on the other end of the line. And my grandmother says to my father, "You've raised an idiot." and truer words were never spoken. I was caught up in the details of the birth and was using denotative language to describe the sacred. That was a mistake. They wanted to hear it's a healthy, bouncing baby boy, et cetera, and I finally got to that point. So we can make mistakes by racing to the denotative, racing, as it were, to the dogmatic. So with that kind of Religion 101 in the background, let's see what difference it makes for conflict. Several characteristics of religion follow from this understanding of the sacred. First, every expression of the experience of the sacred must necessarily fall short of the reality. I've indicated that. It's going to fall short, whatever our language. One cannot comprehend absolute reality, so one must resort to symbols, analogies, connotative language. The first response really is silence. You know, the wonderful poem by Keats upon reading Chapman's Homer. And he's comparing the amazing experience he had upon reading Chapman's translation of Homer and what it did to him, to Magellan's men rounding the, I think it was Magellan, rounding the corner and seeing the Pacific Ocean. And the last line of that poem is silent upon a peak in Darien. You know, there's the Pacific Ocean, and you don't immediately sing a song about it, you're stunned into silence, which is the appropriate response. But then you begin to write the poetry, you begin to look at the topography, you begin to go deeper into detail. So you begin with silence, and we often begin interfaith with silence in a way to evoke this experience. Then you go to elusive and connotative language, and only then to the dogma, so to speak, to the more explicit. And this must always be broken in a way, as Tillich says, that we remind ourselves that it's only relatively adequate what we say about God, about the sacred. Second, so religion requires at its depth a kind of connotative language. Second, therefore, religion is always already a matter of hermeneutics, theory of interpretation. It's always about interpreting. What does this mean, and how do we decide what it means, and what are the markers? Is it when Arius and Athanasius, I'm conflating a lot, but in the battle over the divinity of Christ, there was a great dispute about whether Jesus was fully God, if the Logos is fully God, or the created Word, the firstborn of all creation. And there were important disputes about how to figure that out. Is Jesus, at the time, it was understood that the community around the Mediterranean believed that Jesus was the Word made flesh. That was not the question in some of these conciliar debates. The question was whether the Word, the Logos, was God of God, light of light, true God of true God, one with God, or was this a hallowed firstborn of creation, you know, created by the one God? And there was a big debate over whether God is one, monolithic, absolute. How can there be a second member of the, how can there be a son or anyone else? God is self-contained, perfect, non-needy. And the theologian and company of theologians promoting this under the theologian Arius used remarkable scriptural exegesis of various texts of Jesus. John 17, I think, everything I have comes from you, Father, nothing is on mine alone. In other words, I'm dependent upon you. And Arius said, well, of course, that can't be God. It's a dependent creature. And look at the text. Look at the scriptures. Now, of course, scriptures are complex and can be argued on various positions, but he was considered and was a great presbyter of the Church of Alexandria, a great theologian. And he made that argument. It was very compelling, and he had many followers. It was actually, for a while, the majority position. The Word is not fully God. And then along comes the party of Athanasius, whom we call saint, which gives the plot away as to who won. Athanasius said, the criteria is the scripture, but it's also the lex orandi, the rule of faith and the rule of worship. And already in these Christian communities, we're praying to Jesus as if to God, and we're baptizing our children in the name of Jesus. Let's reflect on that. What is the Spirit leading us to? And in fact, the Spirit of Christ is a spirit of service. It's a spirit of neediness and dependence and fulfilling need in a relationship. It's not a monolithic. It's not. So Arius, however brilliant, his criteria are not fulsome enough. The criteria also have to include not only the scriptures, but the worshiping community and the work of the Spirit in the community and so forth. My point here is not so much who is right and wrong. The church proclaims that Athanasius was right, so to speak. This is the cliff notes of 400 years of bitter fight. So you got that in 30 seconds. It was not so much who was right and wrong. We say Athanasius was, but the criteria. How do we determine what counts? What are the sources that count as we dispute and debate and decide what do we believe? What do we proclaim when we use words and doctrines and so forth to bind the community together? So symbols frustrate the dogmatists in a way, the absolutists, those who wish to control the meaning, including those whose sense its power, the power of the sacred, and wish to harness that power. This is because symbols, by their very nature, leave a space for encounter with the other, for a kind of dialogue with the recipient of the experience. They are invitations to engage, almost to co-create, most of all to interpret. Regarding so many questions begging to be answered, the sacred is ambivalent in a way. It doesn't produce formulaic answers or clear, concrete answers. There's so many, you want to say, well, Lord, what do you really mean? These texts, the Torah, the New Testament, the Quran, they seem to be internally contradicting themselves. Jesus at one point says, if they're not with us, they're against us. If they're not against us, they're with us. Well, Lord, what is it? Would you resolve these? And they don't yield a linear response, and that can be frustrating. But it also opens a space for encounter, for conversation, for interpretation that's not necessarily hostile. That can be done in good faith. So symbols, by their leave space for encounter, to engage, to interpret. Regarding so many questions begging to be answered, the sacred is ambivalent. It could go various ways. That is the interpret of it. So in the Torah, I think it's in our Jewish college reminds us Deuteronomy, maybe wrong, maybe Genesis. I'm sorry. I set before you life and death. And what's the next line? Choose life. So one way to think about that is the experience of the sacred is pre-moral. That is, the experience is mysterious, tremendous, fascinans, awesome, powerful. Do I want to harness that power? Can I use it? Can I become a magician and invoke it? Can I sell it? Etc. We do that pretty well at Notre Dame, but that's another topic. How do I engage this awesome reality? Is it a spirit rather than I submit to it, I wrestle with it, I won't let that angel go until it blesses me, so it's a constant struggle of interpretation? Which way do we go in that ambivalence? So I set before you life and death, and that's the experience. Boy, this could go in the direction of life, this power. It could be destructive, and then the interpreter within the text says, let me tell you how to answer this one, choose life. Now, this is an interpretation, in a way. Choose life. I know the experience of Yahweh is awesome, and it could be destructive, and it seems destructive. Choose life. It's a moral injunction interpreting what that text means, what that injunction means. Choose life. It is a sign of my age that I used to know the chapter and verse of that line, and I cannot recall it right now. I'm sorry. As a result of this ambivalence of the sacred, third, religions, far from being monolithic, are internally plural. Again, this is obvious to us, but it's worth putting out there on the table. These religions are internally plural. There's no such thing as Christianity. There is no such thing as Judaism. There is no such thing as Islam. There are Christianities, Islams, Judaisms, secularisms. They're plural. This is not to say there's not principles of identification, identity, and coherence. It's to say that to generalize about any one of these traditions, even about this own community in Grand Rapids, is hazardous, because you cannot avoid engaging the specifics and the details. So we often generalize. We say Christianity this, or Catholicism that, or Protestantism that, or whatever. And because these are internally plural, they are contested, there are many voices, and these many voices in schools, that will never end. Sectarianisms, sects, divisions. There have been many efforts, especially in the early 20th century, to bring everyone together in unity. They failed. I mean, a lot of good came from these efforts, and to show common ground in a way, and a hope for a kind of unity of the faith. But it's in the DNA, it's embedded in the nature of these traditions, that they are going to be internally plural, because the experience of the sacred yields that kind of often creative, sometimes destructive, debate, conversation, and then prideful splintering, or casting aspersions on someone who has the narcissism of tiny differences. No, agrees with me on 99% of things, but not on the important 1%. Let's test your knowledge of Jerry Falwell, 1965-4, said the most dangerous man in America is who? Do you think? You're supposed to let other people give the wrong answer before you give the right answer. But thank you, you're right. Billy Graham. So some people, when I ask that question, say Elvis is the most dangerous man because his swiveled hips beneath the camera. He was dangerous, but he's clearly of the devil, so we can just name that very, very frankly. What was another popular answer? 1960, it was 62, it was early 60s. The Beatles, please. They're angels, not devils. No, so it's, I'm sorry, it was like 61 when Falwell said this. So who in 60 would be kind of the Antichrist candidate? John Kennedy, Catholic president. Ooh, this is not good. Good candidate. But the answer was Billy Graham. Who's the most dangerous man in America? Billy Graham? To Jerry Falwell, why? Because Falwell said, Graham doesn't understand that we're at war spiritually with this ambient culture, with these Elvis and the Beatles and the Catholic president. It's all going to hell. It's what we've predicted. It's what we anticipated. And Graham is out there in the mainstream. He'll make alliances with rabbis on one issue and Catholic priests on another, and God help us, feminists on something else, or before the word's even used. He's out there doing deals, and he understands the 5 fundamentals, and he understands that's dangerous, that he is not keeping the boundaries firm, and that he's willing to reach out on points of commonality. This became, I think, more the case. There are experts in this audience who know Billy Graham's work much better than I do in his life. But that was Falwell's comment, that Graham is so close, but threatening because he doesn't go the whole 100 yards in what the implications of the fundamentals are and of what it means to be a true evangelical at that time in Christian history in the United States. So that is part of the dynamic. As a result, religions are internally plural. They contain multitudes, multiple voices and perspectives, and often unreconcilable plethora of narratives, exemplars, teachings, practices, precepts, and institutions and laws. The natural tendency to have one's own views and interpretation prevail leads us to expect to see, and indeed we do see, religions constantly engaged in conflict of one type or another, not only across traditional lines or communal lines, but within religious communities, time, space, geography, culture. Just add those variables. So religions are not above time, space, geography, history, and culture. Those add other ingredients of dispute and difference within religious communities that are transnational or trans-regional. So it's not just that they're contesting in a kind of the abstract, they're also from different parts of the world with different cultural matrices in which they're understanding the faith, whatever it may be. There's regional variation, there's linguistic variation, there's political variation, the state in which they're living. So is it any surprise that religions are going to be filled with conflict of various kinds given all these factors? How do you hold on to tradition in this context? How does a community preserve its tradition? And this is not a lecture on tradition. I'll simply say this: tradition is an important concept, and the Latin traditio, there's a context, again, 2 important contexts for understanding the word tradition. Traditio, to hand down from generation to generation. So we hand down our faith, our religious practices, whether they are Jewish or Muslim or Christian or even in South Asian religions, we hand them down in various ways. And in doing so, we traduce, another sense of tradition. We betray them. The very act of transmitting them across generational lines, across time and space, there's an element of betrayal, of traducing. That's another level of complexity. So Those who think religion is pure, monolithic, consistent across time are not thinking historically, and they're not understanding the complexity that comes with religion. So, in sum, internal and external conflict is baked into religion qua religion. No surprise, but it's worth remembering. Second source, my second source to put before you of inter and intra-religious conflict follows from these characteristics of religion I've just mentioned. This response to religion marked by ambivalence, conflict, and internal pluralism. So the second source is I refer to the religious tendency toward absolutism, which is one of the reactions to this confusing context that we're in, where it can be destabilizing and disorienting to see so many different interpretations and to see such variation. And yet we are trying to respond to the ultimate reality who commands us, who masters us. How do we convey that reality? Well, all this fighting and all these heretics who are choosing, heresy from the word to choose, choosing their own interpretation. Heresy is usually a relative term. Who's in power gets to decide who the heretics are. It's more complicated than that, but heresy is about choosing one's own way. And so the reaction to this bloomin' buzzin' confusion around things that are supposed to be from God, to use that term, lends religious leaders and communities to move at times toward absolute statements. Stop it, here it is. And it's one thing to have a definitive statement, it's another thing to say, and this is absolute. It is inerrant. It is free from error. It is as if from God's mouth to my ear. I'm running out of time, so if I have time in the questions, someone ask me this question. What was your experience, Scott, of teaching seminarians from Pakistan, India, Muslim madrasa students this summer? Barbara and I were in Nepal, and we were talking to them about sacred text. And one day, they of course are trained solely in the Quran. And I was trying to explain Christianity to them and in one session and trying to dispel their deep misconceptions. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about a kind of absolutist interpretation. In their sense, a kind of dogmatic interpretation of the Quran, if you will, makes Christian biblical literalists look like pikers, right? Truly, really, I mean, because there's a very different purchase. I say this with respect to them, not in any way disrespect. And you'll ask me and I'll tell you when I have more time, this challenge of recognizing that the revelation, the truth of God is without any condition, without any dispute or disagreement, trying to make it absolute. This is from God's mouth to my ear. If the sacred is the uncreated and ultimate reality of the universe, it can be readily construed as demanding from its inherence an unconditional devotion, and that the truth that is articulated is in itself non-negotiable. As a political scientist Charles Lieberman put it 2 decades ago, militance is a religious norm. That is, the drive to be, in the sense, extreme, that is, non-compromising, non-qualified, unconditional. This seems to be, I'm called to do this out of sincere act of faith, in good faith, to what I've received from the one God. If to be devout is to be zealous, if to be zealous is to be a militant, to fight, to wage holy war of a type, and if holy war is to be taken literally so as to include or even privilege lethal violence, not that these are, I don't mean to suggest an inevitable logic toward violence. That's not what I'm saying, I'll come back to that. But there is a certain logic that can lead itself toward, from these different moves. I must be militant, I must be zealous, because God knows things are falling apart around us. And the younger generation is not following the tradition. Even Billy Graham is not, and I'm Jerry Falwell, whatever it may be. You can give various examples. Then I'm called to be particularly zealous in this context. And it might be that I do need to engage in some kind of warfare, spiritual or physical, because there's nothing more important than God's will. my own family, my children, we were taught as Catholics in, I know you find it hard to imagine that I would be of this age, but during the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis, I was a second grader, and the Catholic nuns in our school said two things. If there should be a nuclear attack, hide under your desk. That's going to help a lot, sister. And number two, you should be so lucky that the Soviets would invade and put a gun to your head and say, do you abjure Jesus Christ or do you confess Jesus Christ? And of course, you second graders will say, I confess Jesus Christ. And then they will shoot you, and you will go right to heaven. You should be so lucky. Stop laughing at my faith. But you know, this is very different than a suicide bomber in a particular religious tradition. I'm not making false equivalents, but the mentality is, what's most important is your soul, your spiritual destiny. And ultimately you subordinate, if you're really devout, you have to subordinate everything else to that. That is, I think, what Lieberman says when he says militance is a religious norm, whether he's right or wrong, that's what he's getting at. That we're drawn to, if we're lukewarm, we are spit out of the Lord's mouth. So are you really a true believer? Are you really going to commit? So extremism in the service of God, to paraphrase Barry Goldwater, is no vice. A certain kind of extremism. At times, scholars, journalists, and policymakers use the term fundamentalism as a shorthand for this extremist orientation of the sacred. I don't have time to, I'm happy to, and the questions, I want to leave time for questions. Fundamentalism, I woke up every day for many years hating the word because it's inadequate and there are all kinds of reasons not to use it, including the fact that when you're describing a global phenomenon, which is really striking in some of its similarities, to use a Christian term and impose it upon, so we can talk about that forever. So I'm not going to really use that term, but what I am talking about when I get into this third and final characteristic of religious violence and wind up is I'm talking about a logic that sometimes is called fundamentalism. We can use another word for it. But part of my understanding of religions around the world in the modern era, and modernity, living in the modern era, the time of great inventions, of the shrinking of time and space, of the movement of peoples, of the rise of evolution and other forms of science, all that accompanies the term modernity, and there's much to that. In that context, religions that are moving into the modern period, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they, in particular, they all had to adjust, to oversimplify. Obviously, they had to adjust. And one way to think about that adjustment is there are certain modes of religiosity that emerged as possible within the modern period, right? So we might call them different things. Liberalism or modernism is a certain mode of reacting to kind of the secular modern, and it has its own logic. And fundamentalism, or use whatever term, has its own logic as well. And these logics make sense if you understand them. One doesn't need to endorse or criticize whatever, but they have a certain logic to them. If there's a perception that the modern is secular, which can be understood as atheistic or agnostic or denying the source of all life and goodness, and that we have to fight back against that. So I'm going to come to that in a minute. So there are different modes, and we're all believers cannot ignore modernity. None of them can ignore this. It's a challenge. Pluralism is a challenge. Multiple beliefs, no beliefs. What's one of the highest American, I forget if it's number 3 or 4, the category that's rising fast, if they're asked what religious affiliation do you have? Nuns, and I don't mean N-U-N-S. That would be way down at the low bottom of this. God bless, sister, wherever you are. But I mean N-O-N-E-S, N-O-N-E-S, none. So there's challenges in that context. So the second challenge or source of religious conflict is this circling the wagons in Hindu nationalism. This is striking around the world. in certain forms of chauvinistic Buddhism, in Christianity and Islam. It's striking that this pattern is circling the wagons, shoring up defenses, extinguishing or at least softening or forgetting the aspects of the tradition that say, be courageous, go out and embrace the other or engage the other. Do not, the Quran does not say on every surah, exterminate the infidel. It doesn't. None of these sacred texts say that. There are lines, which we sometimes call emergency clauses, in these texts. I'm serious. The Granth Sahib, the book, the holy book of the Sikhs, if you read the Granth Sahib, the living guru, every other line almost, exaggerating a little bit, is peace, reconciliation, love one another, reach out. And then there's a line that says, however, if Sikhism itself should be under mortal threat, it is your obligation to take up the sword. So most of the time, but there's emergencies. There are times when we are really under threat. And you can find these clauses if you interpret the text a certain way in almost every tradition. The traditions that there's something you can retrieve selectively and say, these are dark, bad times. Normally we love and forgive and reconcile, but this green revolution that the Indian government has imposed upon the Punjab, and they're taking our crops, and they're bringing agribusiness, and they're killing our small farmers, and they're assaulting our religion. They are trying to exterminate us. And there was some evidence this could be construed. What must we do? The guy who was the leader in the early 80s, Bindar Wallace, said, we add to the Sikh turban and kippah and other symbols the motorcycle and the revolver. These are sacred signs. Get on your motorcycle, get your gun out, and start killing Indian government officials because they're trying to kill us. And the Granth Sahib says just this. Most of the time, everything's cool. Now, take up the sword. So you have a tendency toward absolutism. And then third, the third of these three, closely related, is the the logic that goes with this. A logic that is, has the following characteristics. A logic of fundamentalisms, but again, this is a misleading term because it doesn't mean that every Christian who would be called a fundamentalist, say, or it would follow this logic. Also, to call Muslims fundamentalists, and if you say, as with Christians, scriptural inerrance or literal reading of the Holy Scriptures, well, it means every Muslim is a fundamentalist because every Muslim believes the Quran is the recitation of the angel, direct word of God. So I'll conclude with this and we'll have some time for questions. What are the elements of the logic that lead to a kind of absolutist, defensive, and sometimes conflict-ridden response? And they're the following. This is from the Fundamentalism Project, a brief summary of 3,700 printed pages, plus about a dozen independent monographs that other scholars working on this project over about 10 years came up with, that studied religious movements around the world. So we had scholars who are experts in Sikhism or in Buddhism of a sort, a type, Hindu nationalism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism. So we had about 75 scholars who understood their movements and were asking, are there any resemblances? So tell us about your movement. Don't tell us about fundamentalism. Tell us about your movement. And then later in the project, we said, well, what are the family resemblances here? Not comparing them with doctrines or histories or whatever, but what are the patterns of thought and reaction against what seem to be threatening forces to belief? And it's really quite, it's striking. So here they are quickly, and then I'll conclude and we'll have some time for talk. So I'm doing quickly and I can elaborate them later. One is this logic is a reactivity, a reaction to what is perceived as the marginalization of religion in modern life. The discrediting the marginalization of religion, of faith, of belief in the sacred and the supernatural and so on. These movements are reacting, they are in a reactive mode. Their leaders interpret the world as moving in a direction that's not just happenstance or coincidental or contingent, it's conspiratorial. In some versions, it's Satan. It's the evil one. So it's this whole rise of secularism and disbelief and moral turpitude and all the things that we would worry about, or that social critics who believe that our age is more wicked than any other, they would say this comes from marginalizing God, marginalizing religion. And I can give you examples of this, but I'll just do one for each one of these and give you many examples for each one of these characteristics. There's Bin Laden, you know Osama bin Laden. In his back pocket, he used to carry a little pamphlet called Milestones, or signposts along the way, and it was written by Said Qutb, who was an Egyptian school teacher. Egyptian, came to America for a while, was turned off by America in the 50s, thought we were too, even in the 50s, too kind of immoral and consumerist, et cetera, et cetera. He went back and he became part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he wrote this manifesto that said, we are living, and he actually borrowed this concept from a Pakistani author named Maududi, who wrote in the 1920s in the new, in what is now called, what was then part of India is now Pakistan, Maududi. They both had these ideas. These are two Sunni Muslims. And Qutb kind of clarified or crystallized it as follows. We are in a state of jahiliyyah. You've heard this? You know the term, jahiliyyah? So it's a Muslim term that refers to pre-Islamic ignorance. So Qutb and Maududi diagnosed the 20th century. What's happening? The West, the godless West, with its oil men and its capitalists and its businessmen, are colonizing our sacred lands, and they are infecting us with their irreligious. It would be better if they were really Christians. They claim to be, they're not. They're post-Christian. They say they're Christian, but they're pagans. And they have the power, they have the money, they have the resources, and they're infecting us. One Iranian scholar called it, we're being West-toxicated. We're being intoxicated by the West, by their materialism and their prostitutes and their alcohol and their drug. So we're literally being intoxicated, drunk, and toxic. We're being poisoned, and we don't know it. It's an insidious, quiet process. So it's West-toxication, and Qutb said, we're living in Jahiliyyah. We're living essentially in a time before the Prophet came, before Muhammad came and gave us God's revelation, in that pagan era. And so later interpreters of Qutb said, what we must do is takfir wal hijra, we must flee these societies and kill Mubarak, kill Sadat, kill the rulers who claim to be Muslim but are just imposters. We must give war within Islam, and then we'll turn to the non-believers, the infidels, later. So Qutb bin Laden had that little manifesto. We are living in Jahiliyyah, where religion has been marginalized to such an extent that it's as if the Prophet never even came. Before Qutb wrote, you didn't go around asking a fellow Muslim, are you a Muslim? Prove it to me. Do you practice the 5 pillars? But once Qutb wrote, you can't take for granted that a Muslim is a Muslim just because he or she says he is. You've got to submit them to a scandalous test. That is, are they willing to come forward and really practice Islam? So a reactivity, these groups are reacting, and there's a logic to this, to the marginalization of religion. That's the problem. There are all kinds of other things, the oil men coming in, and pornography, and divorce, and this, that, and the other thing. But at the root of it, the reason for those things is that you've marginalized God, religion. That's the problem. So that's the analysis. Second, these are modern people. They're not the Amish, right, in this logic. The people who are reacting this way, they are software engineers, they're computer technicians, they are people who understand instrumental logic of the modern period, right? They grow up in this logic. And so when they are recruited into these movements, even though they may be working in kind of scientific, techno-scientific worldview, they are also, they compartmentalize in a way. It's hard for them to integrate that worldview with the enchanted worldview, to use Max Weber's term, of the religious. You know, of demons and angels and and Mahdis and Messiahs and so forth. But so they kind of compartmentalize. They go to the Bell Laboratories or wherever. Pardon me if you're from Bell Laboratories and you're not in this. They go to their job as engineers or software computer engineers, whatever, and they follow the logic. But when they go to church or mosque or synagogue or temple, they are entering into a different realm, and they try to keep these worlds kind of intact within one person or family. But when they are recruited into a religious movement that says we've got to react to this, we've got to fight back, their mentality is what they don't leave behind, their engineering mentality or their architect or whatever. So when they look at those sacred sources, they select. Now we all do that. Everyone selects, of course, you have to. But they select with a certain, which verses, which teachings from this vast, complicated historical tradition are most useful to fight back against the West, colonial powers, the infidel, whatever it may be. And they select that. So Ayatollah Khomeini, said, how do I justify the fact that for centuries, Shia leaders, Muslim Shia religious leaders in my tradition have eschewed political power and been quietist? There's a little doctrine very poorly known called the rule of the supreme jurist. He retrieves that, he gets some court theologians, he puts under house arrest the other Ayatollahs who don't agree with him, and he gets some theologians to develop this doctrine, make it to a doctrine, this idea of at certain times there will be a rule of the Ayatollah, and that's him. So it's a selective retrieval. He needs something from that toolkit, not the whole thing, because the whole thing is that's to be a traditionalist or a conservative or orthodox. This fundamentalist mode is neither conservative or traditional or orthodox. It is an engineering mentality. I say that with due respect to the engineers. But it's an instrumental logic in part for the purpose of, so what that does ironically to the tradition is really plays loose and fast with some parts of the tradition by selecting and then mixing and matching. So it's selectively, this logic tends to be absolutist, as I said, I won't say more about it. It tends to be dualist, very sharply so. We are the elect, you're the reprobate. We're the children of light, you're the children of darkness. We are the adherents of the hidden imam return, you are the, etc. And so and that's important not just as an idea, but it's important functionally, organizationally, because I need to know who my enemies are, and then I need to know because in this murky atmosphere, you never know. So I want to be scandalous. Do you believe in the literal virgin birth? Not a metaphor, literally, Mr. Engineer. Do you believe in the return of the hidden imam? Literally, not just as some, you declare yourself. Because if you're a little bit lukewarm about this, you're not one of the children of light. You are already poisoned, compromised. This is the strict version of this. And then finally, not least, and then I'm finished, is we got started late, didn't we? The last but important part of this logic is a kind of expectation or a situation that we are in the end times, or we're in a special dispensation in history. We're in the millennial kingdom, or we're in the time of apocalypse, or we're in the time, and this is very important because these groups will recruit, these types of groups, recruit Hindus or Buddhists or Christians or Jews or Muslims from in the last 40, 50 years, from two groups. They recruit from Orthodox Jews, right? That is conservative Orthodox Jews in Israel, who understand their scriptures and their tradition. They're religiously literate. And they understand that Judaism is not a religion of violence, of striking out against the secular or the unbeliever or the non-Jewish or those who are falsely Jewish. That is not its primary theme or its thing. So this becomes a challenge. How do you recruit people who really know that you're not to be engaged in violence against anyone, much less outsiders or innocent people. Well, you say it's Messianic times. It's Messiah time. And the Messiah is here. And the state of Israel is participating, even though those secular Zionists don't even know it. And so go out there and settle these Palestinian-occupied lands, occupy them, and claim them to be part of Eretz Israel, the whole land of Israel promised in the Bible. And if there has to be some militant aspects of that in the underground, so be it. Because this is not ordinary time. This is the time that the Messiah is coming in the Jewish name. The Messiah is here in the state of Israel. God worked through these clunky secular Zionists who don't even understand themselves, who established the state of Israel, doing God's will without even knowing it. And we true believers with the big kippas, I mean, really, in case you don't know, here we are. We're telling you, this is the proper interpretation of Judaism, and Messiah time is here, and it started with the movement toward Israel and the establishment of the state, and now we're expanding to the territories. And this is because this is not ordinary time. This is Messianic time. Now you can find this move in all these moves. So this kind of apocalyptic end times special dispensation is very important because it helps to explain to the true the literate believer, this is why you might be called to militants now. If you're really plumbing the scriptures and the text and tradition, you need to be ready to fight. That's to be orthodox in this setting. In this particular 21st century setting, to be orthodox means you got to put the revolver in the motorcycle as part of the symbols. So that becomes ideologically important. This is end times, and functionally important. The second group they recruit from, by the way, you're wondering, is not just Orthodox and conservative who want to be drawn into this logic of conflict, often deadly conflict. And that's the younger who know nothing about Islam or Christianity or very little. They're religiously illiterate, but they are now, as you know, approach, especially in Islam, online, and they are given a kind of a quick indoctrination, you know, not lifetime long, not struggling with, but one of the challenges around the Islamic world is that, what is the sacred language of the Quran? Arabic. It's not supposed to be translated. It is translated, but the Quran is not supposed to be translated. And the authoritative interpreters of Islam speak Arabic. What percentage of Muslims around the world speak Arabic? A small, relatively small percentage, like in the 20%. Middle East is not the concentration of Arabic speakers in the Middle East are not the concentration of Islam. South Asia, Indonesia is the biggest Muslim country, etc. So most Muslims do not speak Arabic. They are dependent upon an imam who says, this is what it says and this is what it means, right? And let me tell you what it means. And if you're 20 years old, you're not an autodidact, but you want to belong to the community. So that's the second group. And again, that kind of apocalyptic, this is really serious, this is dramatic, this is, you know, that is a different kind of appeal to these younger groups. So we're left with these three sources of conflict, three sources of religious conflict, all kind of interrelated. And these very real cases do not exhaust the vast array of militant actors and motives, some of which are rooted in a comprehensive quest for justice. And we have to recognize this. They're not just evil actors in the world and good actors in the world. Yes, there are evil people, and of course there are many holy people. But it's more complicated than that. Bin Laden believed he was pursuing justice for Muslim people. He might have been crazed, he was a lunatic, he was violent, but he says, why is it that when he spoke from the cave on October 7th, 2001, the same day George Bush spoke, Bin Laden said, well, you think I'm this terrible terrorist, and maybe I am, but you know what? When you bomb Iraq, or there's collateral damage, and hundreds of children are killed in the Muslim world, it doesn't make your headlines. You know, but if you lose a few American lives here and there, that's a big sin. I'm not defending him. Please do not tar and feather me at the end of this talk. That's not my point. But the point is, in that, it's a rhetoric of justice at some level, Now, it can be picked apart, but most people don't say, hey, we are evil. Come and join us. Now, this is a complicated topic I shouldn't introduce now, because in some cases with a group like ISIS, we have to think twice. But nonetheless, there is this notion, people use the language of justice with sincerity, with very different consequences. And so you have the question, is the appropriate faith-inspired response to religious extremism a unilateral and unconditional opposition drawn from the playbook of political realism? Do we just fight these people, perhaps? Is it a multilateral, critical, and systemic response drawn from a kind of personalist response, drawing attention to the economic, military, and other forms of structural violence? These are important questions. Each of the world's religious traditions brings its own array of goods to the table: nourishment for the journey, spirituality and practices proven to cure souls of the ambivalence that paralyzes the moral imagination. So each of these traditions brings this array of goods to the table: practices of discernment, hospitality, reconciliation, forgiveness, repair of the world. Unlocked, the moral imaginations embedded in religious traditions spurs creativity along a horizon of hope and sustains platforms and networks that move conflicted parties toward and into modes of conflict transformation that are positive. How does this unfold among those we call religious peace builders? So I've been giving you the negative, right? The troubling aspects, the sources of conflict, and of often deadly conflict within the religious imagination. But this last paragraph I read is, but the other side of it. And even within some of these movements that we would demonize almost, even within those movements, there are spaces of hope and light and creativity and reconciliation, promise and forgiveness. How do we unlock those? How do we accompany those? How do we journey toward the common good with those with whom we agree, but even more importantly, those with whom we disagree? Stay tuned for this evening.